Hello, Internet. If you've seen me talk for any length of time, you know I'm fiercely opinionated on what makes a horror game tick. Often, I've grappled with what makes one good or bad, and while I realize that that's pretty subjective, although it's objective when it's coming from me, I have much fiercer thoughts on what makes a scary horror game. And I'm confident enough in those thoughts to share them with you all. Pew, pew. Let's get into it. So first, let's talk about the concept of bleed. This sent me down an etymology rabbit hole, as I've always assumed that bleed was a way to talk about the bleeding effect in Assassin's Creed or something like that, where memories leach over from ancestor to ancestee, whatever it's called. But it's been used as shorthand for when a character you're playing has feelings or experiences that color your own feelings and emotional state. But it turns out that it is also cited as being coined by Emily Care-Boss at RopeCon, a role-players convention in Finland in 2007, which ran in August, 3 months before the first Assassin's Creed game was released. These seem remarkably close together for the same iconic term, so if anyone has any clarification I couldn't find here, let me know. I find it absolutely fascinating. That aside, the point is that I think for a horror game to be scary, a level of bleed is necessary. Your character needs to feel fear in a way that is able to extend to the player. Let's look at a few quick examples on how this can work. In the game Killer Frequency, you run a radio station that's been routed all the evening's emergency calls while there's a killer loose in town. The killer isn't after you, only the people in calls, and you're therefore playing someone physically apart from the action. I would argue that, unless you're a very empathetic person for those that are calling, the game isn't very scary, as it doesn't capture any real danger to the character in any way that would port over to the player. Now, I want to emphasize again that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, Killer Frequency might be my favorite horror game of 2024, it's just not particularly scary. Land's smartest invertebrate approved. Five Nights at Freddy's, for all you people whose first experience with the internet was this precise video on YouTube, thanks by the way, love the support, is a game where you're a night watchman in a play place filled with violent animatronic mascots. Its entire focus is on jump scares, unexpectedly including terrifying images onto the screen or right up in front of it to make the player jump. Jump scares are a common tactic for horror games as they're an easy way to make people scream, jump, or otherwise elicit their surprised and fearful reactions visually and audibly. In my opinion, they're a fairly cheap tactic, and the shine wears off quickly and the horror fades rapidly after a few deaths to one. I say this because it's my honest opinion and not because I'm easily reduced to screaming in tears every single time. I am the bravest at games. Twitch streamer and YouTuber Vexcitement had an amazing take on the effectiveness of the early Silent Hill games and how they can affect feelings between player and character. She noted one of the most powerful parts of their gameplay is the cramped corridors and claustrophobic conditions of game navigation to create a feeling of being trapped and in a constant state of danger. I would expand on this to show why it is so effective as a bleed tool. These conditions transfer to a player's stress and anxiety, especially with the game's suboptimal combat situation, driving up mistakes, frustration, and the ability to really connect with the character's desperation when trying to navigate a town that clearly isn't ready to show you a lick of kindness. These, I think, are good individual examples that illustrate my point, but let's dig a bit more into the weeds and see what one can do to make a scary horror game. There's an article I must have read like 5 years ago or more that I simply can't find that was absolutely formative to how I looked at horror. It boiled down to a simple expression for tabletop gamers: don't stat out Cthulhu. Primarily about giving the Lovecraftian monster a sheet in role-playing games, but I think this concept translates wonderfully to video game mediums as well. A key thing about horror is typically helplessness, so this is something to balance against what type of game you're trying to make. What horrors will be present in the game? How will the player survive their experience with them? Are they statted out and therefore beatable? Giving players a weapon and the ability to beat their enemies changes the game considerably, sometimes to the point of changing the genre. To give the characters the power to win gives the player power as well. The enemies they face are an obstacle to beat, not just something to survive. The more players can win, the more fear is lost. Not always a bad thing, as this provides its own type of catharsis and enjoyment, but catharsis is the antithesis of horror. So, let's talk catharsis. Catharsis, in the sense I'm speaking on it, refers to emotional release. Good, bad, whatever, it's a sudden sharp drop of riled up feeling. Now, I think any game needs catharsis to be enjoyable. A game that riles you up and goes nowhere doesn't particularly sound like anyone's cup of tea. For a non-horror example, think of Elden Ring or other FromSoft titles. These games are almost entirely built around catharsis as an enjoyment tool, building up intensity and frustration and even fear when fighting particularly tough bosses, with the promise of feeling amazing and accomplished when the enemy is finally felled. Or, for an example, in the aforementioned FNAF, H-Death is a catharsis. When you're frightened and then something fills your screen and you're sent back to the home screen, there's a fear release and then calm until you can start again. Most importantly to my point, catharsis is a tool, one that can be used for good or for ill. The key point of it is that in order to be satisfying, the player would need to have a lot of tension built up beforehand. If these cathartic points are exploited too often, then the game just prevents being able to preserve any strong feeling long enough for the player to get invested. This leads me to a few points: early deaths and the timing with which to see the game's monster or monsters. First off, we have my biggest pet peeve in a game centered around atmosphere and tension, and that's making it extraordinarily easy for a game over state to be introduced, be it through character death or something else. I think that keeping characters alive while making their players feel tense and in danger is a difficult balance that separates the strongest games from their weaker counterparts. When a player gets a game over, it separates them from the action, it breaks their connection from the character. There's a reminder to the mind that there's no real danger, that the game is something to be strategized around and beaten. Of course, the balancing factor here is that danger has to be as real as possible in the game. If the player realizes they're safe no matter what they do, all the tension drains away and memes ensue, which also isn't conducive to a horror environment. I have two examples of this from the We Harvest Shadows demo, an absolutely crazy, lovely, cozy horror game that I found that will hopefully get its kinks worked out in time. The game was quiet for the first 9 or so days, focused on setting up your farm and seeding a few unsettling horror elements. Go to bed when it's dark, you can only go to bed early when all your tasks are done, bad things happen in the dark. The final day's task was just to make it through the day. And hey, you have a shiny new gun! Sadly, I ran out of ammo on the shooting practice task the day before, so it was a pretty neat novelty item to lug around. I made my way through most of the day just fine, though I admit a bit more boringly than before since I didn't really keep up with the farm knowing it was the last day of the game. Then, out of nowhere, dogs came out to attack me. That was terrifying. I ran, couldn't figure out how to stop them, and then I had a brilliant idea to lock myself in my house. Rip, apparently walls only applied to me. But this was the big issue I was talking about. I was helpless, yes, but in a way that was distinctly due to an unworked glitch. I didn't know the context of what was chasing me, and I got killed without knowing what to do with that experience. I then had to restart the entire slog of a day with no new knowledge or actual fear, just frustration. I ended up avoiding the ghost dog zone because I wanted to make sure I finished the demo. Then I made it to the night and the actual intended scary part of the evening. I was brought out to an abandoned shed I'd happened upon before and saw it had a note in it telling me to stare at something, but not for too long. Screw that, I was going to bed. Then, damage. Just enough to get me to start running and wheel around to find what was going on. I was being chased, and as I made a run for it again and I got hurt, I realized what the note had said and turned around to lock my eyes on it. It stopped. This was tense. I had just enough control to keep myself alive for short bursts, but had to break line of sight on it frequently in my rush to get home. This was a masterclass in tension. I was terrified the whole way home, and even though this never actually killed me, I was constantly scared it might if I so much as slipped up. When I finally got to the house and through the upcoming nightmare scene, my relief was palpable, but still carried with it a feeling that the following days would be no safer. This was amazing horror. I cannot overstate enough how well this was done in this small scene, and I want to hold it up as an example on how an indie project can successfully make something great. And the wait for the horror, the 9-day wait, not having to wait a full day that you need to start again when you die, was also an important part of the cathartic experience that I want to detail at length, because using time and obscurity to build tension is also a wonderful way in making an excellent scary experience. Let's start with BioShock. See, with my earlier notes, I think this game works much better as an action game with some pretty scary implications, but the player character is given too much power in my opinion to make this game truly scary. However, it does start off the game with some excellent horror beats when you're more helpless. When you're brought down to the City of Rapture with no context of what it has become, you see the individual there to greet you getting brutalized by some humanoid creature, flashing lights making it difficult to make out her features for any useful period of time. Rose disappears from view shortly after, instead opting to horrify the player audibly while trying to get into the pod. It's limited contact before she's gone, but it's enough to establish fear in whatever you're going to be facing once you're set loose in the city. A lot of good scary media will do what it can to obscure its most terrifying features for as long as it can. In the Alien movie and game, the full xenomorph takes a while to arrive, and it takes even longer to see it in its entirety. It leaves viewers and players to imagine what's creeping around, and it's so much scarier than having constant access to it. If you don't see what's casting shadows all the time, you're bound to jump at them a lot more, you know? It also helps with the power balance I was talking about before, at least in the early stages of the game, when you can fight humans easily, the robots less so, and the xenomorph not at all. This is a way of giving the player some agency without removing it completely. My final example is my favorite example, such a wonderful mix of horror concepts that it almost cultivated a chapter of game too scary for me to complete. Resident Evil is a series I have complicated feelings about. It's never really resonated as horror for me, at least before 7, and even 7 was partially frightening to me. Even so, it was freaky enough and had me holding my breath just enough I'd categorize it as such. Most of Village was the same. The first chapter had Lady Dimitrescu, unkillable at the time, stalking you throughout her mansion, and being followed around by something I can't take out is a quick way for me to need to get my brown pants out from my dresser. But this was a setup, nothing in comparison to what was to come. See, in the next chapter, Mr. Kicking Butts and Hand Trauma makes his way down to the basement of a creepy old house and subsequently gets all his weapons taken from him. This changed everything for me. Suddenly all my power was stripped, and I couldn't help but notice a few items in the house had hide prompts listed on them. No threats had even appeared yet, and I was holding my breath around every corner. You actually get quite far into the level without anything happening, but this didn't stop me from twitching at every movement and sound I heard. No lie, I'd actually put my controller down some point in this section because I couldn't handle it. And when something is about to happen, there are signs, blood streaks along the floor, audio cues that you are absolutely boned. The creature chasing you is fast and weird, and you don't have time to get a good look at it if you want to survive the encounter. Hiding places also don't give you a great view of the thing, so you're stuck freaking out, not knowing what you're looking at, with no way to protect yourself if you're found. It's incredible. I'm never playing that game again. Basically, there are a million things that make a game good, but a completely different set of qualifiers that make a game scary. What about you? Do you think there's something that makes a game particularly frightening? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, please throw a like and subscribe my way. It helps out more than I can say. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you at Mr. Heisenberg's Sit in Utopia.
I said sit!